All right, hello and welcome everybody to the first of the autumn talks from the Long 19th Century group. I'm going to put in the chat the webpage for the group because this is the place to go now to find the link to the current talk and all those kinds of things. And if you go there and you look at the current talks, you'll see that next week is actually a social event with readings and performances. So I invite and encourage everyone to bring something either Victorian or semi-Victorian to share and do a reading next week. So we can chat about that in the Facebook group if you like. But feel free, anyone who's either watching the video here or who is attending today, please do consider bringing something. And then the following week, then September 23rd, we will have Lorraine, our very own Lorraine, presenting on Marsden and the Wedgwood connection. Do you want to say a word or two about that, Lorraine?
Sure. Basically, what I've done is written a lecture that connects during the mid 19th century, why the Wedgwood Company decided to create a line that reflected the Victorian taste. You know, everybody thinks of Wedgwood being neoclassical, and that's where they started, but they had to stay in business and they had to compete. So I give a little taste of defining arts and crafts and the arts and crafts movement and how this particular line of their production fits that mid-century Victorian taste.
Excellent.
Excellent. That will be delightful. All right. So let us get started here with Tracy's talk for today on aural haunting in the stories of M.R. James. So I ask everyone if you could please mute your microphones. Thank you very much. Tracy, I turn it over to you.
Thank you. I'm just hoping it works. We'll see. So tonight we've got M.R. James, one of my favourite three, the other two being that bloke Hardy and that bloke Poe, as you know. So aural haunting, as in what we can hear but not necessarily see. Generally a whole lot scarier, in my opinion. Anyway, in many respects, hearing is the primary human sense. We are largely unable to select what we hear and what we do not hear, and cannot easily defend ourselves against the audible, which leaves us vulnerable to both physical and psychological disturbance. The ear favors no particular point of view. We can't shut out sound automatically. We simply are not equipped with earlids like we are with eyelids. Disturbing images may be shut out by closing our eyes, but there is little protection from disturbing aurality. Perceiving disturbing sounds from an invisible source will arouse feelings generally of trepidation, which makes the auditory a perfect vehicle for conveying terror. If one hears a potentially threatening sound, but cannot see its source, then the ensuing sense of terror is heightened. Just think about getting up at 3 a.m. to go to the loo and you suddenly hear something but can't see it. So does this work? Next. Woohoo! Yes. Regarding the short story craft, M.R. James contended that two ingredients most valuable in the concocting of a good story are, to me, the atmosphere and the nicely managed crescendo. Through the use of sound, and indeed the deliberate absence of it, he was able to concoct an atmosphere of malevolence. His executors of unappeasable malice, as they were called, often heard rather than seen. This emphasis on sound and its manipulation may be traced to the fact that James was an oral storyteller before he was a writer of fiction, and that his tales were originally intended for a listening audience. In the study of the Provost's Lodge at King's College, Cambridge, James positioned himself behind his desk as an ample and benign scholar, gold-rimmed spectacles, quietly recounting tales of unimaginable horror. A number of his stories were read to the Chit Chat Society at Cambridge, beginning with Canon Alberich's scrapbook in October 1893. By 1900, the stories had become a yearly ritual, enjoyed by a gathering of James's close friends at King's over Christmas. And this is where we get the ghost stories for Christmas tradition from. James had no need of props or bombast. His quiet and understated method of delivery worked to create an atmosphere of dread without recourse to thespian techniques. Among his many academic achievements, M.R. James was a polyglot. He was fluent in Latin, Greek, Coptic, French, Swedish, and Danish. The last two of these he taught himself in order to be able to read Scandinavian folklore in the traditional language, because it's traditionally an oral mode of communication, for which being able to hear and digest the tales in their original words was essential to an appreciation of the nuances required. James was described by numerous biographers, such as, James was described by numerous biographers as having a natural ear for language. His mimetic brilliance was also widely remarked upon. Impersonations of friends and colleagues were uncannily accurate, and this talent for mimicry was an important factor in the success of his readings every Christmas. James's most terrifying ghosts are invisible, their presence marked by rustling, crying, whispering, and in a neighbour's landmark from 1924, by diabolical shrieking. These acoustic presences are elements within the fluidity of soundscapes. It is due to the shifting nature of the size of sounds, their shape and the character of them moment by moment. They overlap with each other, they leach into each other in unpredictable ways. This is perfectly illustrated in the maze scenes in the story Mr. Humphreys and His Inheritance of 1911, in which the protagonist is left completely disoriented by sounds of an indeterminate nature which follow him, shifting and overlapping as they do so. In the stories of M.R. James, sounds are alien, savage, and malevolent. This talk focuses on 4 stories by James, each of which exhibits disturbing aurality, which haunted his listeners and continues to haunt his readers to this day. Number 13, "Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad," Mr. Humphreys and His Inheritance, and A Neighbour's Landmark. By exploring the primalness of the auditory, we can see how James utilized sound to promulgate terror through auditory images as elusive shapeshifters. Madge Nicholas Franken is an executor of unappeasable malice, who, when he is heard, is not visible, and when he is seen, it is always indirectly via a reflection or shadows, and always in silence. Franken inhabits room 13 at the Golden Lion Hotel somewhere in Denmark, a room that only exists at night, and for which the neighbouring rooms, 12 and 14, adjust their proportions at night in order to accommodate it. The blackboard in the hotel lobby does not list a number 13, which leaves Anderson, the English guest in number 12, in some perplexity when he mistakenly tries to open the door of number 13, thinking it is his. Confusion is compounded by the fact that when Anderson does gain access to his room number 12, it seems to have contracted in length and grown proportionally higher. However, by daylight, his room does indeed feature the requisite height and number of windows. When the door marked 13 appears in the evenings, Anderson can hear footsteps and voices, or a voice within, which suddenly cease whenever he stands directly outside the door. He hears a quick hissing breathing as of a person in strong excitement, and wonders if he has been subjected to a repeated auditory hallucination by night that cannot be corroborated by visual evidence during the day. Anderson begins to doubt his state of mind, wondering if his sight or his brain were giving way. It is notable that his sight is the first of his senses that he questions. For once eye culture usurped ear culture, when oral traditions were replaced by the written word in the 15th century, the visual came to be regarded as more comprehensive and trustworthy of the senses, while the aural was left behind, with associations of passivity, superstition, and hearsay. In modern culture, seeing something provides better proof than hearing something. However, in James's tale, it is Anderson's sight which becomes questionable to him, not what he hears. The hotel proprietor, Herr Christensen, laughs with scorn when questioned by Anderson and emphasizes, with much iteration, the fact that number 13 does not exist, nor had ever existed before in that hotel. This leaves Anderson uncertain, wondering whether or not he has been subject to some kind of illusion. In fact, at one point, he thinks it's something he's eaten. Emphasis in this story is placed on sensory disorientation. James presents Anderson's perplexity with a sudden shift from the occupant of room 13, having previously only been heard, to his now being perceived visually by Anderson through his window at number 12 via shadows on the facing wall, because of course he's never seen directly. So here we go. The shadow from the next room evidently showed that he, Franken, was dancing. Again and again his thin form crossed the window and his arms waved and a gaunt leg was kicked up with surprising agility. He seemed to be barefooted and the floor must be well laid, for no sound betrayed his movements. Herr Christensen's knock at the door and his subsequent entry into Anderson's room serves to shift Anderson's attention from one dubious visual perception to another. To judge from his look of surprise when he found himself in the room, Herr Christensen was struck, as Anderson had been, by something unusual in its aspect. Focus then shifts once again from the visual, the room has changed, to the aural, when both Anderson and Herr Christensen suddenly hear singing from what they think is number 14, in which currently resides a rather staid lawyer, Herr Jensen. It was a high, thin voice that they heard, and it seemed dry, as if from long disuse. It went sailing up to a surprising height, and was carried down again with a disappearing moan, as of a winter wind in a hollow chimney, or an organ whose wind fails suddenly. It was a really horrible sound, and Anderson felt that if he had been alone, he must have fled for refuge. The landlord sat open-mouthed. James here conveys an atmosphere of eeriness via atmosphere, the metaphors of sonic desolation. The sound is dry, almost tactile, an entity that sails up and down, disappearing with a moan. It is an image of sound represented visually, creating an awareness in the reader of a quality of otherness, of something alien. Herr Jensen, in number 14, thinks that the unearthly din is being created by persons unknown in number 12, yet is brought up short when he storms in to confront them. But what in the name of heaven does it mean? Where is it? Who is it? Am I going out of my mind? The 19th century French psychiatrist Jean-Étienne Esquirot believed hallucinations occurred as a result of the brain creating sensory impressions which were in fact illusions, or what he called sensory errors. By the 1890s, when James was beginning to compose these tales of terror, Esquirot's theories were widely accepted throughout Europe, and treating hallucinations had become a major occupational concern for the relatively new science of psychiatry. James here appears to be questioning the validity of a sensory error being experienced simultaneously by different individuals. The shock of the acoustic experience has caused the protagonists to doubt their own sanity. The vocal sounds emitting from number 13 alternate between hideous singing and crooning laughter, which leaves the men shivering at the sound. When they decide to investigate this grotesque aural phenomenon, they find themselves enveloped by a sudden, deadly quiet as they face the now plainly visible door marked with the number 13. This particular circumstance highlights the inexplicability of the episode, and that an emphasis on engagement with one sense will result in the deprivation of another. Here, the visual comes with sudden silence. No matter our religious beliefs, the unassailable physical fact is that the phenomenon of voice hearing must have a neurological correlate. In that theory, we can explain, chart, describe it. But the vocal sounds heard by Anderson, Jensen, and Christensen, emanating from number 13, cannot be explained or charted. They are not sensory errors. They are episodes of sound occurring in a room that doesn't physically exist. Here, James presents eye culture as having no monopoly at all over ear culture when it comes to sensory reliability. On to our next story. O Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad, is possibly the best known of M.R. James's ghost stories. It's been adapted for both radio and television numerous times. The face of crumpled linen is certainly one of the most disturbing images in James's fictional oeuvre. But it is the rich sonic tapestry comprising whistle, wind, and wailing that makes the story memorable. They are sounds that herald a psychic crisis of personal doubt. Like the majority of James's protagonists, Professor Freudian slip, Parkins is a Cambridge Don, a bachelor and a cynic with regards to the spirit world. For him, concession to anything which cannot be adequately explained, such as ghosts, is equivalent to a renunciation of all that he holds most sacred. He heads to the seaside hamlet of Burnstow, the fictional equivalent of our Felixstowe, in order to pursue research and improve his golfing skills. A colleague who is planning an archaeological dig asks him to examine a Templar preceptory while he's there. Parkins duly does so and comes across a whistle concealed in a cavity, the cylindrical object making a metallic clink when he discovers it, already producing a sound before being seen or used. Thus begins Parkins's engagement with an alien sonic environment. The minute he deposits the whistle in his pocket and heads back to his hotel, he attains a heightened sense of awareness of the ambient sounds of the natural world. He becomes acutely aware of the dim and murmuring sea, or how his feet rattle and clash through the shingle. When Parkins turns to look back down the beach towards the Templar site he's just left, he suddenly notices the shape of a rather indistinct personage. As with the gentleman at the Golden Lion Hotel in number 13, it is the visual that remains questionable, not the aural. By introducing the whistle, James creates a sonic environment in which the sound emitted is diffused to listeners, both human and revenant. Upon inspection of the whistle, Parkins finds two inscriptions. I cannot speak Latin, please forgive me. Flafer bis flee, which he translates as thief, if you blow, you will weep. And Quisest este qui venit, which Parkins translates as, who is it that comes? Knowledge of Latin was a prerequisite for studying at Cambridge until well after the first half of the 20th century. Thus, the character Parkins has no excuse for subsequently ignoring the warning he has just read. He blew tentatively and stopped suddenly, startled and yet pleased at the note he had elicited. It had a quality of infinite distance in it, and soft as it was, he somehow felt it must be audible for miles around. It was a sound, too, that seemed to have the power, which many scents possess, of forming pictures in his brain. He saw quite clearly for a moment a vision of a wide, dark expanse at night, with a fresh wind blowing, and in the midst, a lonely figure. How employed, he could not tell. Perhaps he would have seen more had not the picture been broken by the sudden surge of a gust of wind against his casement, so sudden that it made him look up. The description of a sound containing infinite distance and being audible over great expanses, even though its timbre was soft, invokes a sense of auditory otherness, an alien quality that defines constraint within a particular landscape. The hypnotic effect of the sound of the whistle is such that it induces a visual image for Parkins. Being utterly absorbed in his new discovery, Parkins blows the whistle again, unaware of what he has summoned. The sound of the whistle had so fascinated him that he could not help trying it once more, this time more boldly. The note was little, if at all, louder than before, and repetition broke the illusion. No picture followed, as he had half hoped it might. But what is this? Goodness, what force the wind can get up in a few minutes. What a tremendous gust. It's enough to tear the room to pieces. The enthrallment produced by the first sounding of the whistle is broken by repetition, for the object's purpose has now been achieved, the conjuring of a malevolent revenant. The auditory phenomenon of a standing wave of sound involves sound folding back upon itself and building up in complex layers. You quite often get that in caves. By blowing the whistle, Parkins has unleashed a sensory wave of folding sound, perceived by both himself and the revenant the whistle has summoned. Particular objects possess a tonal frequency, which triggers a feedback loop, rather hypnotic in quality and inducing a moment of vivid mental imagery and hallucination. Parkinson's momentary vision of a wide, dark expanse of night, in the midst of which stands a lonely figure, is torn to pieces by the wall of wind which now pummels his seaside hotel in response to the call of the whistle. Even the cynical bachelor Don Parkins is perturbed by this disturbing aural event. Quickly as it had risen, the wind did not fall at once. On it went, moaning and rushing past the house, at times rising to a cry so desolate that it might have made fanciful people feel quite uncomfortable. Even the unimaginative, he thought after a quarter of an hour, might be happier without it. As with the thin, dry voice of Nicholas Franklin in number 13, whose horrific singing sailed up and was then carried down with a disappearing moan, the sudden wind which accompanies Parkins's blow of the whistle is given anthropomorphic qualities. Moaning, rushing, rising to a desolate cry, as if the wind was a corporeal being. So disturbing are the wind's almost tactile qualities that even after a quarter of an hour, it is still capable of inspiring a sense of terror in the skeptical Cambridge professor, albeit somewhat minimized by the euphemism, might be happier without it. Whistling and wind are connected in folklore, itself originally an oral tradition and a subject of fascination to M.R. James. A fellow resident at the seaside resort in Burnstow, referred to only as the Colonel, remarks upon the freakish weather of the previous evening, when the two meet upon the golf course the next morning. He informs Parkins, "In my old home, we should have said someone had been whistling for it." Parkins, the pragmatist, is of course dismissive of such comments, but the Colonel, an ancien militaire, as he's called, secretary of a London club and possessed of a voice of incredible strength, declares that superstition or not, they believe in it all over Denmark and Norway, as well as on the Yorkshire coast. And he is of the opinion that there's generally something at the bottom of what these country folk hold to. Historically, sailors have always maintained that whistling while out at or near the sea will conjure wind. And at least since the beginning of the 18th century, whistling after dark in any situation has been regarded as rather unwise, based on the idea that it will summon spirits and draw attention to oneself. James's singling out of Denmark, Norway, and the Yorkshire coast is his example would suggest that his research into Scandinavian folklore links these particular places to Viking customs. Of note is that one of the qualifiers used by James to delineate the Colonel as a personage of dependability and repute is the possession of a voice of incredible strength. Sonic quality here equates with strength of character and trustworthiness, hegemonic markers denoting the rigid order of martial masculinity. Reducing the Colonel's name to his military rank only also serves to strengthen the idea that he is a man of reason rather than fancy or superstition. Again, we see the privileging of the aural over the visual. The naysayer Parkins then subjects the Colonel to a lengthy disquisition on his theory as regards whistling for wind, based upon what he considers to be incontrovertible facts of physics. The whistle, of course, has not only summoned a potentially destructive wind, but a malign entity whose only purpose is destruction. One of James's formidable agents of supernatural malice. The room Parkins occupies contains 2 beds, and from the one he does not sleep in, he perceives a tossing and rustling. Upon lighting a match, he hears a scurry across the floor from the side of his bed with much rustling. Here, the visual escapes perception, while the aural is present in a rustling form which is unseen. The following day, after successful rounds of golf with the Colonel, the latter is almost knocked down as he and Parkins return to the hotel by a boy speechless with fright. Echoing the wind of 2 nights previously, the boy began to howl. And when the Colonel tries to divest himself of the boy who is now clinging to his leg, the latter continued to howl. From inarticulate animal-like sounds, James then conveys the boy's terror through dialect. "Oh, I seen it wave at me out of the window and I don't like it." According to the boy, it is a figure of some sort in white. It weren't a right thing. The boy's speech is as structureless as the shape he sees in Parkins's window. When the 2 men enter Parkins's bedroom, they notice that on the bed which Parkins does not use, the bedclothes were bundled up and twisted together in a most torturous fashion, which leaves Parkins pondering for a plausible explanation. At this point, Parkins shows the Colonel the whistle, which he discovered at the Templar Preceptory. The Colonel pronounces that it should be chucked straight out to sea, and the men bid each other good night. After sleeping soundly for an hour, a sudden clatter shakes Parkins up in a most unwelcome manner. Otherness, in its many guises, is constructed aurally as well as visually. The otherness of that which Parkins has conjured with the whistle announces its presence aurally long before it is perceived visually. After being awakened, Parkins lies with all his eyes open, breathlessly listening. James's choice of words here is startling. With all his eyes open serves to emphasize the futility of a dependence on or preference for sight over sound. For due to his innate skepticism, Parkins still does not see, however many eyes he has open, what his actions have wrought. The reader-listener of the tale is situated by the narrator in bed with Parkins. There had been a movement, he was sure, in the empty bed on the opposite side of the room. Then it was quiet now. No, the commotion began again, a rustling and shaking. James forces his audience to participate in the same disturbing aural experience as his character. And neither the audience nor the later readership can see what is there, but they all experience it aurally in some way, and Parkins's ensuing mental collapse. James's ghosts and revenants are presented in such a way that they appear to affect the physical senses, even when they cannot be seen. James is especially adept at conveying tactile horror. The aural and the tactile are all the more terrifying for their source remaining unseen. It is the feel of something pressed against his face, rustling incessantly as it forces him backwards toward the open window, which causes Parkins to undergo a psychotic break and subsequent crisis of faith. Parkins then perceives what he believes is horrible, an intensely horrible, face of crumpled linen. The fear of it went nigh to maddening him, and halfway through the window backwards he utters cry upon cry at the utmost pitch of his voice. Had the colonel not suddenly intervened, Parkins would either have fallen out of the window or else lost his wits. It's in the animated intensity of the ordinary, a seemingly ordinary bedsheet has, via rustling, scurrying, smothering, caused a stolid naysayer to re-evaluate the judgment which had sustained his existence for a number of decades. At the conclusion of the tale, the narrator informs us that the professor's views on certain points are less clear-cut than they used to be. His nerves, too, have suffered. The visual and tactile horror of the face of crumpled linen have pushed Parkins to re-evaluate his beliefs. But the alien soundscape of the wind, which accompanies the mesmeric sound of the whistle, a sound which can cross infinite distances, triggering a hypnotic feedback loop, alongside an indistinct but malevolent entity, has also contributed to the leveling of Parkins's cynicism. Next two stories. We start first with Mr. Humphreys. In both Mr. Humphreys and A Neighbour's Landmark, and yes, that is Christopher Lee over there, an alien soundscape acts as a border marking the territory of contested spaces. M.R. James wrote in the preface to Collected Ghost Stories of 1931 that Mr. Humphreys in His Inheritance was executed simply to fill up the 1911 volume of More Ghost Stories of an Antiquary. However, Mr. Humphreys is in fact the first story in which James utilized the motif of acoustic chaos. While sonic imagery is not the dominant feature of this story, as it is later in A Neighbour's Landmark, it is no less effective when it is deployed. It is sound as alien, unfamiliar, other, which causes anxiety, a notion of there being an us and them, whoever we and they may be. Whispering and rustling with no visual source, which unaccountably follows a person through a landscape, causing disorientation and panic, is easily transmuted into the sound of malevolence as a physical entity by a master of the supernatural, such as James. Mr. Humphreys inherits a house upon the death of an uncle whom he doesn't really know, and part of the large gardens includes a maze. It has been locked and is overgrown and has been for decades, his uncle having forbidden entry to it. While Humphreys waits for the maze to be cleared for exploration by himself, he investigates the uncle's library, and he comes across a 17th century volume of sermons in a rather dilapidated condition, in the margins of which the original owner has penned a tale, Parable of the Unhappy Condition. This embedded narrative revolves around a man who resolves to enter a labyrinth or maze in order to obtain a jewel of great price and rarity contained within it. Naturally, friends try to dissuade the man, as the maze is known to harbour pitfalls and snares and ill-omened inhabitants which lurk in the corridors of the topiary. Once the man enters the gates, his friends hear no more of him, except for cries afar off in the night, which make them turn in their restless beds and sweat for very fear. As with his previous stories, James emphasizes the notion that the aural is more terrifying than the visual. The acoustic chaos which this parable centers around is introduced by James when in the embedded story, the unnamed man retrieves the jewel and then sets out to return to the maze entrance. The man becomes sensible of some creature keeping pace with him in the next alley, stopping when he stops, continuing when he does. The archaic language used by James as a disconnecting device serves to place the reader at a distance from the immediate action so that they become a helpless witness to the horrific event being described. And indeed, as the darkness increased, it seemed to him that there was more than one, and it might be even a whole band of such followers, at least so he judged by the rustling and cracking that they kept among the thickets. Besides that, there would be at times a sound of whispering, which seemed to import a conference among them. But in regard of who they were or what form they were of, he would not be persuaded to say what he thought. When the man is found the next morning lying in the road in a swoon most like death, he is questioned as to the cries that were heard the previous night. About midnight, he heard his name called from a long way off, and he would have hallooed at the pitch of his voice, and he supposed that the echo or the noise of his shouting disguised for a moment any lesser sound, because when there fell a stillness again, he distinguished a trampling, not loud, of running feet coming very close behind him, wherewith he was so daunted that he himself set off to run, and that he continued till the dawn broke. Sometimes when his breath failed him, he would cast himself down flat on his face and hope that his pursuers might overrun him in the darkness. But at such a time, they would regularly make a pause, and he could hear them pant and snuff as it had been hound at fault, which wrought in him to so extreme an horror of mind that he would be forced to betake himself again to turning and doubling, if by any means he might throw them off the scent. This passage conveys how precisely James chose the words he used with which to delineate an atmosphere of acoustic chaos. Pitch, voice, echo, noise, trampling, all serve to highlight the auditory confusion of the man in the embedded narrative and what he is being subjected to. The man is being assaulted, almost physically, by waves of sound that undulate, washing over him and swirling around him, so that he is unable to fix a particular point of origin. The unnamed man of the parable has experienced touching at a distance. He is forced to cast himself flat on his face and hope that his pursuers might overrun him in the darkness. He feels compelled to throw them off the scent, as if they were hounds taking part in a hunt. From a psychiatric point of view, one could also ask if these moments of aurality qualify as hallucinations of hearing. James leaves the episode ambiguous, ending the embedded narrative with, "I will spare to set down the further recital of this man's troubles." The word recital itself is an interesting choice, being a musical term for a performance by a small group. Has the unnamed man's theft of the jewel triggered a concert of cacophony calculated to inspire terror? Whether or not the parable was meant to be read by Mr. Humphreys himself as a warning of the dangers of seeking access to that which is forbidden, he goes ahead anyway with his exploration of his uncle's maze the following day, accompanied by two new female acquaintances. The group becomes lost, surprise, surprise. Confusion ensues, and the gardener arrives in response to repeated shouting. However, as the gardener searches for them, he has some difficulty in making his way to the party. First, he is seen or heard in an inside alley, then almost at the same moment in an outer one. The experience of Humphreys and his party mirrors that of the man in the parable, as they are each subjected to sounds that have a distorting effect upon their vision. Sounds that undulate and swirl, causing acoustic confusion. The maze is a soundscape of malice and is duly razed to the ground when Humphreys discovers its creator's ashes are stored in a globe at the center. A globe which features inscriptions dedicated to various deities of death and pandemonium. Well, of course. Last Story, A Neighbour's Landmark, published 13 years later, extends the motifs of acoustic chaos and the science of sound by introducing a figure from Scandinavian folklore, the Shrieking Ghost. In many places, such as China, India, and the Middle East, certain spaces are believed to be inhabited by voices. Betton Wood, in this story, the site of aural haunting in a neighbour's landmark, is an alien soundscape whose inhabitant, evil or otherwise, is constrained within the borders of a contested piece of land. James owned several volumes of the local legends from Jutland, however you say it, among which he would have found a good many shrieking ghosts. This motif almost invariably occurs in association with another, the ghost who is walking as punishment for dishonest appropriation of land. The presence inhabiting Betton Wood had coveted and then appropriated the land of another. And not only has James transported a figure from Scandinavian folklore into an English setting, he has heightened the horror by changing a mere shout to an ear-shattering shriek. An ear-shattering shriek is acoustically much more effective as a tool of auditory torture. In terms of narration, A Neighbour's Landmark is one of the very few James tales written in the first person. It provides an intimate insight into the ability of an alien soundscape to ravage the intellect through extrinsic sounds, which can distort perception and sensation. That which walks in Betton Wood knows why it walks or why it cries, is the refrain through which the reader and listener is introduced to the terrifying spectre in A Neighbour's Landmark. The unnamed narrator, having read of the now stumped up Betton Wood in the library of his host, Mr. Phillipson, decides to explore. Of course he does. Upon nearing the area for the first time, he is suddenly assailed by a shriek, which thrilled into my right ear, piercing my head in a note of incredible sharpness, like the shriek of a bat, only 10 times intensified, the kind of thing that makes one wonder if something has not given way in one's brain. The narrator held his breath and covered his ear and shivered. Shriek, pierce, and sharpness all evoke sensory images of a sound that is capable of physically wounding. A sound that can touch at a distance. The initial contact of the voice makes the protagonist all at once turn as if stung. James portrays the sense of hearing as being intimately bound up with that of tactility, as in the maze scene in the parable set within Mr. Humphrey's inheritance. The disembodied voice as a signifier of the uncanny and alien is a well-used trope of Gothic and supernatural fiction. But James channels the phenomenon through a first-person experience in such a way that his readers share in the aural horror suffered by the protagonist. The auditory assault is repeated. And just then, into my left ear, close as if lips had been put within an inch of my head, the frightful scream came thrilling again. Imagery that links lips and ears and is vocalized for a listener who responds physically to the sensory experience is a hallmark of an author who understands the nuances of the spoken as well as the written word. As a polyglot and consummate mimic, James was able to manipulate language in order to exploit an array of sonic signifiers, capable of disturbing the psyche to such an extent that both listeners and readers are able to conjure images of the shrieking ghost of Betton Wood long after the story has concluded. A scream which is at once hideous, jarring, and piercing, emanating from an unseen source, is a physical phenomena without a neurological correlate. Hideous it was beyond anything I had ever heard or have heard since. I confessed to myself that I was afraid. So jarred were all my nerves with the cry on the hill. This scream as appears to pierce right through from one ear to the other. Such sounds cannot be explained, charted, or described. Phillipson later recounts to the narrator a statement given to him by a local during his investigations. But no one can avoid the curse that's laid on them that removes the landmark, and so she can't leave Betton. The progenitor of the acoustic chaos in the neighbour's landmark remains trapped within a soundscape which acts as a border, making the territory of a space that will remain contested. Hearing is perhaps the most intimate and existential of the senses. Sounds, voices, auditory images are all elusive shapeshifters. Aural hallucinations conflate source and destination. The man trying to leave the maze in the parable in Mr. Humphreys and His Inheritance is overrun by whisperings and rustlings and cracking sounds created by ill-omened inhabitants who keep pace with him, stopping when he stops and starting when he starts. Elements like the savage wind conjured by the whistle in "Oh Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad" create a standing wave of sound which folds back upon itself and builds up in complex layers. The whistle itself exhibits a tonal frequency which triggers a feedback loop, which is hypnotic and induces a moment of vivid mental imagery and hallucination in the protagonist, Professor Parkins. The tales of M.R. James can be read as a refutation of the notion that society privileges the visual over the aural. Many believe that seeing something provides better proof than hearing something, yet the ghosts, the guests, and the landlord at the Golden Lion Hotel unquestionably believe what they hear coming from number 13, but cannot account for a mysterious door that only appears at night, or the proportions of their own rooms altering each evening to accommodate it. In the stories I've discussed tonight, M.R. James favours alien soundscapes that disorient and confuse over spectres who appear in a clear visual form to threaten their victims and instill terror. Sound arrives in the ear as a tangible entity, triggering powerful emotional responses. The shrieking ghost of Betton Wood causes the protagonist to all at once turn as if stung. Her scream appears to pierce right through from the one ear to the other. Her lips seemingly only an inch from the auditor's ear. But she remains invisible to him. Ambient sounds of the natural world are suddenly intensified when Parkins seems to develop a heightened awareness of them after discovering the whistle. He becomes acutely receptive to the sound of the murmuring sea and of his feet rattling and clashing through shingle. James conveys terror to the reader-listener through extrinsic sounds, the sources for which are always unseen. Emma James's supernatural tales were originally written for the listening audience, who would hang on the reading author's every word. His power to evoke sonic nuances, aural imagery, and alien soundscapes secured for him the accolade of being described as the greatest of ghost story writers. James's mimetic brilliance and ear for language ensured that he was essentially able to think with his ears. James understood the texture, shape, density, timbre, and rhythm of sound, deploying these elements in order to concoct the perfect atmosphere and nicely managed crescendo, his two prerequisites for the perfect ghost story. And I'll leave the last word to the master himself. And there you have it, everybody. Thank you very much.